I'm Connor Old, and welcome back to another episode of Old's Oscar Countdown, the final episode of our 10th season of predicting the Oscars. The Oscars have happened. These are my initial reactions. Going to be talking about my general thoughts on the award show, as well as 3 lessons we can take away in terms of helping us predict next year's Oscars. Yes, we're already starting to think about next year's Oscars, but I want to do a little bit of a debrief in this episode and also tease my new series. I'm not going to go away. We still have weekly uploads, and it's actually an Oscar-related series that I think a lot of you will enjoy. So we'll talk about that at the end of the episode. But as always, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. I asked you to give your predictions. Many of you did in the last video, which was really awesome. Now let me know how you did. What were the big surprises? What were your thoughts on the award show? Ultimately, I make these videos to create an awesome film-going community here in the comments, so I'd love if you were to share that and just watch the video as well if you'd like to do that. That's always great too. But without further ado, let's jump into things. I want to start off with just my general thoughts on the award show. So we'll talk about what this means for predicting and how we can kind of interpret the results later on with the kind of structure of the 3 lessons. But just some initial thoughts on the actual award show itself and the kind of cultural understanding and maybe historical perspective that it will ultimately have. I thought Conan did a good job. I'm a big fan of his, although I'd be surprised if he ultimately does come back next year. It did seem that the room was a little bit tired maybe of his shtick. It didn't feel maybe as new just because he was there last year. So maybe they just need a new host every year to mix things up. But he felt like a steady, stable hand. The show was incredibly long. I was very grateful here on the East Coast that they moved it up an hour because over 3.5 hours is long on a usual Oscars telecast. Usually it's like 3 hours and 15 minutes and they're kind of trying to cut it. So 3.5 hours, they really decided to push it this year, which I was ultimately very happy with. As an Oscars fan, I want more of the show. I can understand why, certain people or maybe the average person wants it to keep it tight in 3 hours so that they can go to bed. But I liked that Conan was able to do a Billy Crystal style inside the movie's opening bit and then the monologue as well. And that for the most part we got nice long speeches for a lot of the individual winners. And that, we had a great Rob Reiner and an in memoriam tribute, and things really felt like they took their time. Now that in part felt to maybe I think sometimes the room felt a little bit dead or low energy, which is maybe why they want the award show to kind of be a little bit tighter in that 3-hour period, that maybe they realize in the room they start to lose people, which affects the show. But ultimately, as an Oscars fan, I want it to be as long as possible. So I thought it was good in that sense. I thought that, like most years, the presenters' bits weren't that good, except for the one with Kristen Wiig. I think she's the funniest person on the planet, and it seems that every year or every time she shows up, she's usually pretty great at delivering on those kind of short presenter bits. I thought we had some good speeches as well, less so from the actors, and I think actually from Autumn Gerard-Arpapa, who won for Best Cinematography for Sinners. I thought she did a great job kind of highlighting the genius of Ryan Coogler and the collaboration of everyone involved, and that was a surprise win, so that was nice to see. It seems that, though, the precursors are still very accurate. That's definitely going to be a lesson from the award show. The actors went 4 for 4, and BAFTA went 2 out of a possible 3, so they were very accurate this year as well. This was an award show that was expected to be dominated by 2 films, Sinners and One Battle After Another, and it was. Whether we have surprises like Sinners beating out One Battle for cinematography, or One Battle beating out Sinners for casting. Ultimately, those were the 2 movies of the night, and I think just from a cultural perspective, not from an awards predicting perspective, a cultural one, I think this will be seen as a mostly positive award show, particularly for the winners, that you have, I think, 2 movies that are going to be around for a long time and celebrated in One Battle After Another and Sinners, both winning a lot. When you think of One Battle, you think of the key awards and an acting award, a picture, director, and then you think of a movie like Sinners, in which all 3 collaborators ultimately won an Oscar in terms of the key ones in my mind. Ryan Coogler and Michael B. Jordan and Ludwig Göransson. It would kind of be like what I keep on thinking about is a 1980 Raging Bull. Like Thelma Schoonmaker won for editing and Robert De Niro won for actor. And if Martin Scorsese ended up winning, let's say, director, we would think back on that as like that was the first set of awards that kind of a triumvirate won in early on, and they were key collaborators. And I think of Ryan Coogler kind of similarly, where if he's going to continue working with Michael B. Jordan, that will be a fruitful, long collaboration with, I'm sure, many great performances. And in the same way, Ludwig Göransson is a key collaborator and a key part of so many of Ryan's films. And then Ryan himself ultimately winning for original screenplay. I thought that was a great result for that film. And ultimately, you have two very popular movies in One Battle After Another winning, and Sinners, and then even a movie like Weapons, a mainstream horror movie that almost never gets recognized. The fact that it ultimately did win its only Oscar is a testament to its strength and its popularity, I think, as a movie that is in the annals of great horror classics immediately. Movies like Silence of the Lambs or The Exorcist. There are very few true horror movies. Even, I think Weapons is even more of a horror movie than something like Sinners. And it's very rare for those types of movies to get Oscars, so it does put it in an elite status. And I thought ultimately Paul Thomas Anderson pointed out with the 1975 Oscars years, one of the best Picture lineups of all time. And he pointed out that there's so many great movies there, it just depends on what day it is that depends on your favorites. And I think similarly, when we think about this year, it's like we can debate, should it be One Battle After Another, should it be Sinners? Ultimately, though, we got a lot of great movies and movies that were rewarded well, and for the most part, it was their night. And I think because they're going to be two popular movies and movies that I think will last, people will look back on this award show fondly, even from a historical perspective as well. Of course, the first female cinematographer to ever win. I haven't mentioned it yet, but the tie in Best Live Action Short, I thought ties wouldn't happen. So now for the next few years, there's going to be people who are maybe predicting ties. I don't think we're going to get that for a long while, but who knows? There's always that possibility. Now it has happened. That was a fun moment. But transitioning now more into the awards predicting side of things, I want to talk about 3 lessons from the awards show that we can learn in terms of thinking about next year, trying to remember these in terms of what this past year has taught us. And I think lesson 1 is that we should trust the industry precursors, in particular the industry precursors. Sometimes it's easy to get caught up in the momentum of Critics' Choice and the Golden Globes, but I think the industry this year really told us some key facts that ended up being true. Whether it be Sean Penn initially winning at BAFTA, or eventually Amy Madigan in Weapons at the Actors Awards, or Michael B. Jordan, and those were the eventual winners of the categories. Or the fact that One Battle After Another won for the Producers Guild and one of the Directors Guild. Still two very accurate places at predicting what the eventual Oscar winner is going to be. So for everyone saying, oh no, maybe Sinners could win because it has all this momentum. Yes, I don't know. I realize it doesn't have any of those industry precursors, but what if? Yes, it's fun to think about, but ultimately what proved true here is that for the most part, most of the categories, even down to Frankenstein winning all the awards, it did, or Avatar winning for visual effects. The industry precursors, the reason why we focus so much on them is because they are so predictive. That's why we rely on them, because yes, we're going to see surprises in cinematography. One Battle won every cinematography precursor and still lost at the Oscars, yes. But for the most part, most of the categories had at least one major precursor win, even in categories that we thought wouldn't matter. Something like Best Documentary. The Perfect Neighbor didn't really have any precursor wins, but Mr. Nobody Against Putin did, and ultimately that won the Oscar. So that is a consideration, I think, going into future years that, maybe we can convince ourselves at the last minute that the momentum is going towards a movie, or that Golden Globes actually does matter, and, just because you have a preconception of a previous idea that you don't want to abandon that. But ultimately the industry tells us what happens. Golden Globes told us, Hamnet was stronger than Sinners. It told us Tiana Taylor was going to win, and Chalamet and Stellan Skarsgård, and none of them did. But the industry, BAFTA, Actors Awards, and PGA and DGA, they're the ones that are most indicative. They're the award shows that we follow closely. Those are the ones that we value the most. And I think it's notable the fact that, some people were predicting a Stellan Skarsgård or Delroy Lindo or Chalamet or Tiana Taylor, and they were totally reasonable predictions, but they were based on critics groups. And yet ultimately they all proved to be false and wrong. And that for the most part, when we think about the recent Oscars, you have to win at least one industry award to be a major consideration, and that was ultimately the case here. And then lesson number 2 is that the Oscars are not what they used to be. I think for a lot of people, they think of the fall festival release, the Oscar bait, the weepy drama. Oh, of course, the Oscars are going to eat that up. And yet, with One Battle After Another winning here, and I think of past winners like Everything Everywhere All at Once and Oppenheimer, what we're finding is a lot of major contenders being released in the spring. We thought that it was always you had to be released in the fall. That's not necessarily the case. The big ones, the movies that actually have been winning, have been dominating and establishing their dominance early on in the year. Oppenheimer now, One Battle After Another. September is still pretty early. Everything Everywhere All at Once. Even something like Coda, which was a Sundance movie, are movies that don't follow the traditional method. I mean, even something like big blockbusters like a One Battle After Another or an Oppenheimer, these aren't the traditional movies that you think of as typical kind of Oscar movies. And I think with the recent expansion within the past 5 or so years of the Academy, becoming more international, now having over 11,000 members, that has really changed what an Oscars movie is. So I think some people, they think of, oh yeah, but that's a type of movie that the Oscars love. I think you should question yourself when you're making those predictions. Are you thinking about the Oscars from 15 years ago, 20 years ago, the Harvey Weinstein era, or are you thinking about the modern era? Because the modern era is rewarding filmmaker-focused, bold, unique, interesting movies, sometimes from independent distributors like A24. When you think of movies like One Battle After Another, or Nora, or Everything Everywhere All at Once, these are not traditional Oscar movies, and yet they continue to win. Even a movie like Sinners, an April release blockbuster genre action horror movie, ends up winning, 4 Oscars? That's a huge change within what the Oscars are. So I think the lesson ultimately, I think is definitive at this point, is that maybe traditional Oscar type movies like a Frankenstein, like a Hamlet, maybe they'll get nominated, maybe they'll get a couple of wins, but in terms of the big awards, in terms of the movies that ultimately make an impact, the Oscars are starting to reward different kinds of movies, and the Oscars, what they were is not necessarily what they are today. And then lesson number 3 is that I think age bias and legacy bias is real. The fact that Timothée Chalamet didn't win, or Jacob Elordi, or Tiana Taylor, or Wunmi Mosaku, or even, Sinners in Best Picture for that matter. The Oscars ultimately are an award show about legacy and putting in your time and being rewarded for sometimes the body of career. I think about that, we'll talk about, on the acting side of things in particular, I think most representative of a Timothée Chalamet. I'd be remiss not to talk about the fact that he didn't lose, because he's an actor that I kind of think is on a similar trajectory as a young Al Pacino or a young Leonardo DiCaprio, which is, I think, high praise, and I think some people have been put off by some of his public comments and appearances, but ultimately, I think the work speaks for himself, and he's an incredible actor and a young actor who's already had this incredible body of work already. So it does seem like he's going to be an actor that will win in his 40s for a performance that isn't as well regarded as something like a Marty Supreme or Call Me By Your Name. And we're going to look back and go, what happened? Why didn't he win there? So I'm just going to kind of mark that out during the time while it's happening. It does feel like he's on the trajectory, and I do think that a high statement's a big goal for him, but I do believe in him as an actor to ultimately achieve those goals. And then even for the Sinners side of things, we look at a filmmaker like Ryan Coogler and we go, well, he's going to make so many other great awards, and he's going to lose Best Picture a few more times before he ultimately does win Best Picture. In the same way, Paul Thomas Anderson, had to lose multiple times for Best Picture. I think of this year maybe like 2007, in which it was No Country for Old Men or There Will Be Blood. And no one really looks back on that year, and even though they love There Will Be Blood, they don't go, oh, No Country for Old Men was a bad movie. The fact of the matter was the Coen brothers had been nominated multiple times for Best Picture. Before that, they did their time, and eventually that was the year. In the same way, Paul Thomas Anderson, almost 20 years after the fact, has made multiple movies that got nominated for Best Picture, and he lost, and he waited his time, and now this is his reward. And in 20 years from now, maybe Ryan Coogler wins for Best Picture, and there will be signs. He sat out for Black Panther, he sat out for Sinners, and all this kind of stuff. And it's just an indication that still, I think the lesson is, when in doubt, go with the older actor. That age bias is real, that the Oscars, when Oscar voters still think about legacy, I think for a lot of people, they thought this was their last chance to reward an Amy Madigan, or their last chance to reward maybe a Paul Thomas Anderson. That was their time, that they had waited. Amy Madigan was first nominated 40 years ago, so just think about that. It's not always the case, but I do think that legacy and age and someone who's put in their time is still a narrative that exists with the Oscars, and it is something to be considered. Now, Jacob Elordi is going to have to wait, and so is Timothée Chalamet, but you don't have to wait. Next week, I'm going to be coming back with another video, a new series I'm going to be calling Redoing the Oscars, in which from the years 2015, every single year up until 1988, I will be talking about an individual category, just one category, switching it every single week, and talking about who should have won. What happened if they did win, and ultimately did the Academy get it right? So next week, for example, I'm going to be talking about the 2015 Best Actor race, in which Leonardo DiCaprio won for The Revenant. I'm going to talk about what if Matt Damon, who was also nominated, won. I'm going to talk about someone who wasn't nominated that year. do some Oscars alternative history, and ultimately try to figure out if the Oscars got it right. So it's going to be a little bit of a historical series like I do every single year, but not talking about foreign films or anything, still talking about the Oscars. We're going to be redoing the Oscars in an individual category every single week. Mondays at 12 p.m. Eastern Time, so I hope you stick around for that. But if not, I will likely be back as well for Old Oscar Countdown Season 11 later in the fall. This concludes Season 10 of Old Oscar Countdown. Thank you for joining and coming along for the ride. And as always, until next time, stay tuned.